Britain in the 1930s was not always a happy place to be. The country faced economic hardship. Many battled with unprecedented levels of poverty, and the policymakers of the day were preoccupied with one central and crucial question: should Britain rearm her once mighty military ahead of what many believed would be a second Great War with Germany? Yet, despite this ongoing sense of foreboding, the months of 1936 were dominated by a question that seemed almost trivial. The newly installed King, Edward VIII, had fallen in love with the soon-to-be twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson, and he was determined to become husband number 3. In this debut season of our brand new podcast, we explore the abdication crisis, attempting to reconstruct events from available source material and solve the many mysteries that surround Britain's most recent royal revolution.
Hello, Royal History Geeks, and welcome to Royal Revolutions Series 1, Episode 8, as we continue our look at the abdication crisis of 1936. I'm James Taylor, Royal commentator, and with me is Royal History Geeks creator Gareth Streeter. Hi, Gareth.
Hello.
Now he's finally gone.
He's gone. Who's gone? Me? I'm not gone.
No, you're not gone.
I'm never
Edward VIII
going.
has gone. After seven long episodes, he's finally made that trip out of the UK.
Or has he? No, he has. He has. There's no plot twist. There's no plot twist with that. He might have wanted there to be a plot twist later on. Who knows? But there wasn't.
No. So how are you feeling so far after all of the twists and turns?
I feel good because so far I feel I've done what I personally wanted to do in this podcast, which was to really get under the skin of what was going on. I'm a big believer in chronology. And I think when we discuss history, this is me being a bit boring. Most of us who love history, you might even call us historians, are quite conceptual people. And we dance between concept after concept. And as a result, we extrapolate our theories based on some quite conceptual points. And sometimes it's not until you really dive into the detail and map things out day by day, week by week, hour by hour, sometimes in the case of the abdication crisis, you realize that some of those theories that you've constructed or perspectives you constructed just don't stand up to that level of scrutiny. And for me, the abdication crisis has always been an area where there's such wildly differing views, and I completely understand why, and interpretations, that I feel that going through things as we've gone through them has really helped me clarify which of those perspectives are probably more substantiated.
Yeah, and I must say, something that we've reflected on before is that it's easy to forget that all of the crisis happened within about 6 weeks or so, because you learn about the abdication crisis and you imagine that it's going on a lot longer because there's so much content, and actually they packed it into a very short space of time. But interestingly as well, you were talking about having answered some of your questions. We're asking people to send in any questions that they have.
We certainly are. So we've said since the beginning of this podcast that we would devote an episode toward the end entirely exploring your questions. And they could be anything. They can be something really nitty gritty and constitutional about the Bill of Abdication, or they could be, something about whether Wallace really loved Edward. They could be absolutely anything. And we will do our best to answer them. In terms of when we're going to be doing that and when you need to get questions to us, because I'm conscious that people could be listening to this podcast in years and years in the future. We are recording this episode on the 31st of January 2025, and we will be recording our next episode where we're taking questions on the morning of the 7th of February 2025. So if you want to get questions to us, please do so before the evening of Thursday, the 6th of February. In terms of how you can do that, there's a number of ways. You can, if you're listening to this on YouTube, just pop a comment in the comment section, or if you want to send one privately, you can email us at royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com. You can also contact us through our social accounts on Facebook, Instagram, X. And if you are listening to us through one of the podcast channels, obviously you can't leave a comment. Email is probably the best way, or track us down on our socials. But we'd love to hear from you. We've got some questions, but we definitely got space for more. So please get in touch with absolutely anything.
Yeah, I've had a few people that I know who've said, "Oh, have you ever thought about this?" And so I've told them, send in their questions and we'll answer them all in that special episode. Now, before we get into December 1936, I believe you have another plug to make, Gareth.
I do. So we, the Royal History Geeks online community, are very active on social media. And one of the newer channels that we have started getting going recently is a Discord discussion group. If you haven't heard of Discord, don't worry, I hadn't until fairly recently myself, but I actually got into it through my science fiction and comic book interests rather than my history interest. But it's a great platform where you can all get together and chat about a range of topics. And it's also quite user friendly because it doesn't give you lots of notifications during the day when you're busy, like WhatsApp does or like Messenger does. So it's quite manageable to squeeze into your life. At the moment, the group is still very much getting going. It's still quite a quiet group. But if you would like to join our royal history conversations, it's about any era of royal history, and it doesn't need to be confined to the UK either, then download the Discord app, search for Royal History Geeks, and come and find us, because we'd love to have you as part of our conversations.
Yeah, there's been some really good conversations, and one thing that I've really noticed is that when I've been to some of the royal events that I've been to, and I've posted images on there, people have been really kind and really engaged about all of those. So I've personally enjoyed all of that. But anyway, back to December 1936, we have Edward jetting off, but as he's going, there's a song that's ringing in his ears. Now, you talked about this, didn't you, a couple of weeks ago, about this parody version of "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." Now, I will spare our listeners from singing it, but the lyrics are: "Hark the herald angels sing, Mrs. Simpson's pinched our king. Peace on earth and mercy mild, Mrs. Simpson's had a child."
Clever.
Well, it's clever, but also very wrong.
Yes, I don't think it was a song. I mean, this is a song as far as we understand it. And indeed, you might know more than I do, James, as you so often do, or some listeners might know more. But as I understand it, this is it's a playground song. It's something, it's not something that anyone famous did on the wireless that got caught on. It's something that kids came up with in the playground, and it in the way that meme culture was as powerful then as it is today, even without the good offices of the internet, it spread around the country like wildfire. And you can understand why, because it's so tantalizing. I'd always been a bit skeptical as to how widespread it had gone. The only reason I say that is because I remember asking my grandparents about it when I was younger and they were still alive. And my grandparents were born, when were they born? So my grandparents were born in 1925 and 1927. So they would have been prime age, really, for this kind of schoolboyish, schoolgirlish rhyme. And neither of them could remember it. Now, they were in Barnstaple in North Devon, so quite far from the centre of things. But the fact that they couldn't remember it might just attest more to the fact they weren't very interested, and people don't necessarily remember a great deal of from that aspect of their childhood. But I had always been a skeptic as to how widespread it was. But having read about it a little bit during the course of this podcast, it does seem that it was quite widespread as a little rhyme.
I think it caught on in as much that it's noted in quite a few places that you did have children singing it in the playground or in the street, and so I would imagine that it did. It's funny you should say about not asking your grandparents. That's one thing I regret now, not asking because I had an auntie who was born in 1926 who she used to tell everybody actually that she was a week younger than the Queen, and that when she was little, her grandma used to say to her, "Oh, you've got rosy cheeks, just like Princess Elizabeth, our Marjorie." And my uncle was similar. So those things I regret now not having asked them. But so anyone who does have any more information about that, or if they to fill in any of the gaps, I'm sure that we'd be more than happy to hear from them.
It should be
Now,
noted as well that apparently Clement Attlee was caught singing it once at a at a family event. So now obviously he was slightly more engaged with matters than others would have been, but that does suggest that certainly at least in and around London it was doing the rounds.
it does. It does. But of course, very wrong because Mrs. Simpson didn't have a child.
No, I'm not sure that it was meant to be a particularly biographical claim.
No, I'm not sure that it
I
was, but
think it's because it rhymed with mild.
I think it probably was because it ran with Marl. But even so, I think that you probably did have some people who believed that she might be about to have a
Possibly.
child, even if, or that they could have had one and the child had been hidden away or something like that. I'm sure some
Well,
people did believe that.
it's interesting, isn't it? Because there had been um, rumors that Mrs. Simpson had been pregnant, which is why a doctor had accompanied Goddard to to France to perform an abortion. So when I first, because I'd always heard the first line, but never the second line until recently, and you did sort of wonder, oh, was this in some way based on those rumors? But I really don't think it is. I think it's school kids realizing that child rhymes with mild and is probably
Yeah.
not shouldn't be dissected far more than that.
No, and we know that that wasn't the case, but it would have been plausible had that happened because you do hear of several society young women who did have abortions carried out in the 1920s, 1930s. So it wouldn't have been inconceivable that that might have happened.
And it also wouldn't have been inconceivable that you would have gone overseas to do so.
Quite. Well, you would at least have gone somewhere that was more private
Mm.
and where you could convalesce as well. But somebody does have a child, and that's the Duchess of Kent, who does give birth to Princess Alexandra on Christmas Day. And the reason I say that is because the royal family have had a pretty awful year. They'd lost George V. There'd been all of this tension over Edward and Wallace. Edward's gone. And so Queen Mary says that the birth of her latest grandchild is the only nice thing to have happened all year.
Mm. Well, and I'm sure that's what she felt. I mean, if you think about it from Queen Mary's perspective, and we've talked a lot about Queen Mary, but it also Queen Mary is such a golden thread running through this whole podcast because she's around in the episode when we're talking about Wallace and Edward's relationship before he becomes king. She's there throughout the year 1936 as things are developing, and now she's also quite prominent in this episode about the aftermath of the
Mm,
abdication crisis, and it's probably one of the biggest war wounds that she had to carry. But if you think about 1936, it started with the death of her husband and it ended with the abdication of her son. And it's very difficult to see what good news there was in between 1936 from Queen Mary's perspective. So to have a new granddaughter must have been incredibly welcome and the nicest way that you could end what must have been one of the worst years of her life.
indeed, it must have. Now, you talked then about Wallace having gone to France, and of course she was in Cannes, but of course Edward can't go and meet
Mm,
her just yet because we talked in previous episode about the issue of the King's Proctor
mm,
and about
mm.
the Simpsons divorce. Now we can easily forget that the Simpsons still weren't actually
No?
fully divorced yet. They'd had their decree nisi, but their decree absolute would not come through for
Mm,
several months, and so therefore Wallace and Edward, even though he's given up the throne for her, he can't be with her at the
mm,
moment.
mm,
And so
mm,
he has, in fact, gone to Austria, to the home of the Rothschilds.
mm,
And that's where he waits until the divorce is absolute and until they are able to get married. And their marriage does take place on the 3rd of June, which is only a couple of weeks after the coronation. The coronation, of course, had been set the date had been set for his coronation
mm,
on the 12th of May, 1937. But of course, it's George VI and Queen Elizabeth
mm, mm.
that are crowned. We won't go too much into all of that there, but the repercussions of the wedding are there's two things I think are significant because we picked up that in that song, Mrs. Simpson's Pinched Our King,
Mm,
Wallace is firmly being seen as the protagonist here, that
mm,
she
mm.
is the one who has set out to ensnare the king and take him away from his people. I would say that after all of the discussion that we've had, there's an element of truth in that she did set her cap at him, but I think that it's very far fetched to imagine that she had anticipated the outcome. Also, there's someone else. We've also just been talking about Queen Mary. Queen Mary is extremely offended by the date of this wedding because it is on the 3rd of June, which would have been George V, her husband's 72nd birthday. Of course, he died
Right.
18 months previously. And Queen Mary writes to Queen Elizabeth, and this letter is preserved in the Royal Archives, that, of course, she did it, but how can he be so weak? I suppose it's out of revenge because none of the family's going.
It's tricky, isn't it, with the royal family at this stage? Because, and I rarely have that much sympathy for the Duke and Duchess of Windsor as they now are. But the royal family sounds like they a little bit want their cake and to eat it too, because none of them think it's appropriate for royals to attend. They don't want to acknowledge it in any meaningful way, but yet they still expect their sensibilities to be observed. So it's tricky. I mean, would that be an act of spite from the Windsors? I don't know. I don't know enough about the circumstances of of when it was. They wanted that. It seems to me that the overriding motivation for the Duke of Windsor was to marry Wallace as quickly as possible, and probably this was the most convenient date. I don't know. Do you think it was an act of sabotage?
I don't think it's an act of sabotage. What I would say is that and this is entirely my own hunch, it's not based on any real evidence. I would I would suspect that it would, if it came from either of them, it's more likely to come from Edward than Wallace.
Edward's the driving force at
Well, not
every
only is
stage of the relationship.
he is the driving force, but not only that, he is the one that would know more about the date being his father's birthday and also how his mother would react. I doubt that Wallace would have had that same insight. She may have suggested, why don't we have it on this date? I don't know. But I think that he would be the one who has said that. And Queen Mary in her letter does say, why is he so weak? I don't think he is weak. I think that it is an act of, even if he doesn't do it deliberately to offend them, he hasn't, it's not about him being weak to prevent it, it's about him having the will to want to prevent it.
I think that's right. I think the narrative that Wallace is the person instigating all these great ills, and I'm annoyed with my son stroke brother because he's weak, is a much easier pill to swallow for a family than to accept that how let down they have been by one of their own. I think even today you hear families and friends do that when there is a big falling out or when there is a big rift and you are inclined towards somebody in it, you are far more likely to want to believe that they have been corrupted away rather than this is just who they were and you maybe hadn't seen it before. I think that's common. I think what's interesting is because to a lesser extent, that's how the whole nation viewed the same situation. And Wallace, although I haven't in podcasts previously necessarily seen Wallace as the most intelligent human being to ever walk the face of the earth, Wallace realized early on that she was going to get the blame for this from a public reaction. And I think her biggest fear was that she would be villainized for all time, which is why you see toward the end of the abdication crisis efforts by her to make it very clear in public she is telling him not to go, to stay, and to abandon her. That you getting very clear intentions from the king to make it clear that this is his decision and not Wallace's, which I think Wallace is probably insisting on because she knows how the story is going to be written. And of course, she was absolutely right.
She was absolutely right. Yeah. And as Queen Mary had written, it's probably out of revenge for none of the family going to the wedding. None of the family do go to the wedding. And his best man is his equerry, Major Fruity Metcalfe, and his wife, Lady Alexandra, known as Barbara, is actually taking several of the wedding photographs. And so it's, and we know that Edward takes that rather badly, that none of his family are there. He had hoped that his younger brother, the Duke of Kent, the brother he was closest to, would be his best man. And he also had hoped that other members of the family might have attended. Don't know so much about the king, whether he would expect the new king and queen to be there, but I think that he certainly had hoped the Duke of Kent would be, and possibly the Princess Royal as well, because he had met her several months before. She was the first member of the royal family to visit her brother, and she visited him when he was still in Austria in February 1937. So only a couple of months after the abdication crisis. So, and she, as when we spoke to Elizabeth Atwood before, she pointed out that Mary was in fact the glue that held the family together. So she's not given up. So to look at Mary for a moment, she's not given up her brother or that friendly relationship she's had with him, but equally she's towing the party line and she's not attending the wedding.
Yeah, I think it was naive of Edward to think the family could come. I could understand why he would hope for it and how he'd feel sad about it, but I think this goes back to, and again, I get this, but this goes back to something we've seen all along, which is Edward never fully appreciating the significance of what he was doing, or being able to see things from other people's side or other people's point of view at all. I mean, even when you think as recently as the marriage of the now King and Queen, even the then Queen, Elizabeth II, didn't actually attend that ceremony because she didn't feel that as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she could attend the wedding of a divorcee or go or be in a civil ceremony context. And that wasn't very long ago. That was what, 2005, 20 years ago.
Yes, 20 years this year.
Yeah. So
and that seems now, 20 years ago, that seems a rather odd and rather anachronistic way of looking at it, and yet 20 years ago that was seen as being quite right and proper, that the Queen would not have attended a civil ceremony.
Yes.
But of course,
even at the time, of course, I mean, I'm old enough now to remember 2005 very clearly, and I think there were obviously people then who thought it was ridiculous that she couldn't go, and other people that didn't. But I think everyone accepted it was consistent with who she was as a person. Yes. So I think if you could, and of course I believe she did go to a blessing or similar, didn't she?
Because they had the private ceremony was held at the Guildhall in Windsor, and if you go to the Guildhall in Windsor and have a tour around, as I have been lucky enough to have done a couple of times, you can actually go in the room where the wedding was taking place, and it's not the usual room where weddings are held there, and that's simply because the windows go out onto the street, so it was in another room because of security reasons. But most of the royal family did attend that civil ceremony, and then all of the royal family, including the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, did go to the blessing at St George's Chapel, Windsor, which was televised. So yes, there was the issue of the Queen not attending the private ceremony, but the fact that she had allowed it to take place at St George's, the fact she attended, the fact that it was televised, did mean that she was giving her blessing to that union, apart from the fact that she had already given her blessing under the Royal Marriage Act. It was a public sign of blessing.
Yes, and it was, I think it's worth saying as well, I don't want to take us on too much of a tangent, but even today, in just normal people's second and third marriages tend to be more low-key. Now, I think that's sad in some ways. There shouldn't be a sense of shame. And I don't think it does necessarily come from a sense of shame, but there's just a bit of a sense that I did the big white wedding last time. In a sense, I see the flaws of having done that because it wasn't necessarily everything we were telling the world it was. And we'd rather do something a bit more personal and a bit more low-key this time around. So, and I'm not trying to transfer that context back onto the sensibilities of 1937. But I think it was a little bit naive of the Duke of Windsor as he became. We haven't really talked about him becoming Duke of Windsor yet, have we? But as he became, to think that, it would be any different.
Quite. Edward and Wallace do receive a rather unfortunate telegram as the wedding approaches. And this is that Wallace is not going to be given the style of Her Royal Highness. She will be known as Duchess of Windsor, because Edward had been created Duke of Windsor just after the abdication, as we reflected in our last episode, because otherwise, if he'd not been given a dukedom, there was the chance that he could run for election to Parliament. But I still think that's rather significant that Wallace is refused that style of Royal Highness, and I'm not entirely sure that was legal either.
No, I don't. It's a really interesting one. I think I think the language is really important here, because it's often said she wasn't given the title of Royal Highness. Well, technically speaking, when a woman marries a prince or a Royal Highness, she isn't given the title. It's just automatic that she assumes that, because she assumes the rank and status of her husband under the courtesy of England, to use the old-fashioned language. And so the decision that Wallace wouldn't be styled as such was deliberately made to take it away from her and deprive her of what should have been her right of marriage. I agree with you about how legal it was. It's interesting that how's the best way of putting it? It's often said in history books that it was the Queen, the person we know as the Queen Mother, then Queen Elizabeth, that was adamant Wallace shouldn't be styled HRH. Now, it might well be that that was her express wish. However, it's clear when you read wide documents around the time that the government was never going to allow Wallace to have HRH. And if the Queen was campaigning for it, that only made it slightly easier.
Yes, and there is evidence in Queen Elizabeth's letters that she was against Wallace being having the title. So we know that there is truth in that, but you're right. I very much doubt that that would have been done simply because of the Queen's whim.
But basically, the government's view, which was apparently quite common at the time and of course was proved wrong, was that the Windsors marriage wouldn't last. And once Wallace had left Edward, as people seem to assume she would be a renegade HRH that would be uncontrollable, because their view was legally, even if they divorced, they wouldn't be able to deprive her of the title of Royal Highness post-divorce. Interestingly, in the 90s, of course, Elizabeth II made the decision that Diana, Princess of Wales, and Sarah, Duchess of York, would lose the style of Royal Highness after their divorces, and that was actually confirmed by letters patent. I am not entirely sure. It would be a big, interesting legal debate whether that decision would hold up in court, because the principle, and previous court cases have ruled on this principle, is that a wife never loses precedence through forfeiture of a husband, which strongly implies the HRH style shouldn't be lost. Now, you could argue that by this time, the pattern, the precedent, that the HRH style is entirely governed by letters patent is so established that that overrides any other legal principle. But I'm not sure that letters patent, which are non-parliamentary legislation, are powerful enough to take away the common law spirit that a woman takes her husband's style and that divorce can't deprive her of it. So I'm not sure that, I think the government were right to worry that if Wallace had lost a husband, she would keep HRH. But I think probably, I agree with you. I'm not sure, even though letters patent confirmed it, I'm not sure depriving her of that status was ever legal.
No. And I think the only other thing to reflect on would be the only way that she would have lost the Royal Highness post-divorce would have been if she'd remarried and taken on the
even that isn't clear. Even that isn't clear, because there is precedent in English history of married women keeping their titles upon remarriage, and the general compromise seems to be they keep their title, but strictly speaking lose their precedence, which has meant most, and that's settled into a pattern where most divorced women that remarry, or widows that remarry, take their new husband's style and forego the old one. But they probably could get away with keeping the old one strictly legally if they wanted to. There is precedent.
Well, of course, when you looking at Diana, Princess of Wales, you mentioned her a moment ago, her stepmother,
yes,
after her father's death, did remarry, but then that marriage didn't last, and so she did then revert to the style of Reign Countess Spencer.
Right, interesting.
Which was as the widow of Lord Spencer, she was entitled to, but she reverted to that title after her divorce.
And of course, Diana's mother did cease using her style as a viscountess when she married for a second time, and reverted to her honourable title which she had through birth. And I think that's certainly the more common practice. But as you've just shown with the case of Reign Spencer, there's a huge amount of fluidity with these things. But the principle seems to be that, at least as a courtesy, women, once acquiring a status, shouldn't lose it. And there have been court cases on this, by the way, I should say. It's not just It's not just an etiquette thing. There were court cases previously that confirmed that a woman that divorced an earl was still a countess. So, and this is why I'm not sure in this context letters patent are strong enough to take away that precedent. I accept that an act of parliament would have been, because it always is, but that's not what happened.
No, it's not. But now, of course, Wallace and Edward have got the question of what are they going to do with the rest of their lives? Are they going to be semi-detached members of the royal family? Are they going to be carrying out engagements of their own? Are they going to have charitable interests, or are they just going to live the good life on the Riviera? And at this point, we don't know where they are. But interestingly, they make a very high-profile visit to Nazi Germany.
It's a really great way to start your new life, isn't it? What should we do to relaunch ourselves? Should we support a children's charity? Should we be pictured, going to Africa on a mission or to take foreign aid? Or shall we find the biggest dictator who has already expressed highly fascist, highly persecutory tendencies and go and have a good knees up with him?
Well, that's what they do.
That's what they do.
That's what they do. They go to visit Nazi Germany. Now, we can look at this at another time because there's an awful lot of detail about where they go in Germany and what they do and who they meet. What I think that we have to remember is that at this point, there's a real question about the Windsors and about their future role. So George VI writes to Monckton, who is still Edward's legal advisor, that the news that he was visiting Nazi Germany was a bombshell and that it was a bad thing and that he would come to regret it. But I think that it's very difficult to form a judgment about the visit. I think that they were deceptive towards the government because they had said that they were not going to pay any high-profile visits, and of course this visit was extremely high-profile, and it's so high-profile now that if you look at the campaign group against the monarchy, they use images of Edward with Hitler as an argument against monarchy, but also as telling the narrative that was the primary reason his association with Hitler and with fascists is the reason that he had to go, as though Wallace was only a footnote in the story. So I think it's difficult. We do know that they do.
Yeah.
No, and we do know that they do have several fascist friends. We talked about the Metcalfes. Barbara Metcalfe was Oswald Mosley's sister-in-law. We know that later they went on to be great friends of the Mosleys because they were neighbours in France. But I think also, to be fair, to provide some context, we have to also remember that this is still 2 years before the outbreak of the Second World War. And although it was known about the amount of persecution that was taking place, there were articles in and headlines in British newspapers about persecution, particularly of Jewish groups. So we know that the anti-Semitism was rife in Germany at this stage. It has to be remembered, though, that you had several high-profile politicians of all parties visiting Nazi Germany and being received by Hitler. So you had Lord Halifax, Lloyd George went, Churchill, and George Lansbury from the Labour Party. So we know. So I think that if you take it out of context and say that they went there simply because of their Nazi sympathies and their Nazi tendencies, I think that's probably taking that argument a little too far, given that at this stage Britain was still having a diplomatic relationship with Germany, and you also had other people visiting. So I think there's certainly some truth in the fact that they did have fascist sympathies and did have fascist friends. But I think you can read a little too much into it as well. I think that you have to remember exactly. You need to remember the date that this was taking place and not what would happen during the war.
I think the whole question of Edward Wallace and Nazi sympathies is a fascinating one, and in a sense is beyond the scope of this podcast, but one I think we would like to come back to in a different occasion. The way I see it, so I'm not talking so much about 1937, I'm just giving a quick sort of my 2 cents worth on the issue as a whole. But the way I see it is, it's a bit like this is going to sound really strange, the debate around whether Richard III killed the princes in the Tower. In that debate, there is a long list of events and activities that strongly suggest, when you string them all together, that Richard III ordered the death of the princes in the Tower. But strictly speaking, they could, and indeed many argue they are, could just be a series of coincidences, which all individually could be explained away another way, which, if you were minded to do so, you could do, because there is no concrete evidence that links Richard to the crime. In the case of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and their Nazi sympathies, I think it's very similar. There are a whole range of sources, and this is more aimed at Edward than Wallace, but partly Wallace too. A whole range of sources and events and instances that you could point to, stretching right back to when Edward was in his 20s, right through really to post-war, that all, when read together, strongly suggest he was a Nazi sympathizer, and probably that Wallace was too. However, each individual event could also be explained differently, and you have to judge whether it could just be a very big and unfortunate coincidence. And those that are, and there are a few who are positive about Edward and Wallace, would say it's a series of very unfortunate coincidences. My take on their actions in 1937, it's not that at this stage they particularly thought Hitler had the right idea about everything, although I think they may have had views that were more that way than we would feel comfortable with. I think it's more that they saw this as an opportunity, and I think this is particularly driven by Edward, A, to be recognised and greeted in style, with Wallace to be greeted as he thought she should be greeted, and for him to be seen to be playing a role on the international political stage, which he had no right to play whatsoever. And if this afforded him the opportunity to do that, he could live with what he already did or didn't know about Nazi Germany.
Quite. And it must be pointed out that the Nazis did receive Wallis in great state.
Yes.
That they did treat her as a Royal Highness, even though we've said she was not given that title or was deprived of using that title. And also, you have to remember that this is Edward's, as you know, you just pointed out, Edward's opportunity to say, "This is me. I'm still relevant. I'm still important. I may not be king anymore, but I am still a prince. I'm still a statesman." And so, I think that you have to remember that.
And what a terrible attitude to have, because as I understand it, after he'd visited Nazi Germany, he was intending to go to the States and and I think it was part of the thing to show that he could liaise between both sides and he could avert a war. He was certainly very anti-war, but so were many at this stage. So you can't particularly hold that against him at this stage. You perhaps can later. But the US visit got cancelled. I don't think they were very open to the idea of a former king trying to be the mediator of the world's politics. But what kind of view do you have of yourself when you decide, I'm a former king, I was king for like 9 months, I'm gonna, or a bit more, 10 months, I'm the man that needs to be saving this. So he had no mandate from any government to be this intermediary. What, and was at least the other figures that went were figures of substantial political weight. What did he think of himself?
Well, I think it was more a case of just wanting to be seen. I personally, I think that yes, there were some fascist sympathies there, but I honestly think it was the fact that they would receive him and receive Wallace and receive them with great fanfare. And I think that he would easily, if Stalin, for example, had said that he would receive them with the same amount of fanfare, which, yes, I know that the communists wouldn't have done that, but just for argument's sake, I think that he would have gone to a far left country to be received in the same way, just as the far right one. For me, I think that the primary motivation is about him being seen as a key player on the world stage and about Wallace being received with the style that he felt that she deserved. And I think that both of those factors would override any of the others.
Yeah, I think it's just an interesting psychology, isn't it? Like, I do understand why a former prime minister wants to carry on having their voice heard even when everyone's bored of hearing it. Like, I can understand why Margaret Thatcher or a Tony Blair, once they've retired, wants to still have a view on the world stage, because they do genuinely know an awful lot. I mean, people will either love or hate their politics or somewhere in between. But most would deny that they will have learned a huge amount by being prime minister of a mid-ranking power for 10 years. And they probably do have valuable things to say. But at what stage? And to an extent, I find this with the Sussexes as well. It's like we must get our voice out there. I mean, maybe I'm just so British and, I always think we should be muted about it. But what's the psychology that makes you think the world must hear your voice? It's just bizarre to me. I say that. I mean, I record these podcasts and like trying to get people to listen to my voice. So maybe I'm being a complete hypocrite. Who knows?
Well, if you are, what does that make me? The other thing, though, is that the government aren't quite sure what they want to do with the Windsors. They're not quite sure. I mean, it is an unprecedented situation to have a king over the water in the way that he is.
In this way, yeah.
Yeah. And so they don't know quite what to do with them. And so a year later, they enlist a rather unusual source, given that we've spoken briefly about Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and about how he was never particularly close to his brother, about how, and also that in his memoirs, in Edward's story, the King's story, he seems to have a certain amount of antipathy towards Henry, which he doesn't to other members of his family. I don't quite know why Henry's been singled out. I think I would guess that it's not that they had particular arguments. I guess that it's that they were never particularly close to begin with.
I think he thought Henry was quite dull.
Well, he did have that reputation from other people.
Yeah.
There was that famous occasion when he'd gone somewhere and he was being told stories. Said, "Well, I bet you've never been to Tidworth," and that was him thinking that was incredibly amusing.
Right. I guess it's, I mean, it does say, you're right. He does, because with George VI and Edward VIII seem to have been close, at least in their younger years. He then has a very close bond with George, Duke of Kent. And Mary, Princess Royal, as you say, is the sister sort of mum figure that holds the brothers together. But yeah, with Henry, there just seems to be nothing. And to be fair, I mean, you're a greater student of the royal family of that era than I am, but I'm not sure that Henry was particularly close to any of them, was he?
He did become closer to George VI and Queen Elizabeth during the war, but I think that was because he was regent designate for Princess Elizabeth. If George VI had died or had been captured during the Second World War, Henry was the next in line. And you also have to remember that Henry was the next most senior member of the royal family, apart from being regent designate. So therefore, in the absence of a Prince of Wales and with Princess Elizabeth being a child, it was down to the Gloucesters to host receptions. They hosted a reception for the coronation in 1937, which is something that you would normally have seen the Prince of Wales do had there been an adult Prince of Wales at that time. So I think that they did become closer, but I think it was because of the situation that they were in. It brought them closer,
and
rather than they necessarily had a close bond.
And Queen Elizabeth and the Duchess of Gloucester got on very well, didn't they?
Well, they did, and they'd known each other as children because they were both daughters of Scottish nobility. Neither of them actually born in Scotland, which you often hear. They weren't actually. They were both born in London. So the Gloucesters are enlisted to test the water for how popular it would be for the Windsors to not necessarily make a return to public life, but to be seen to be on good terms with the royal family. So rather sadly, in 1938, the Duchess of Gloucester suffers a miscarriage. And so anyone who knows anything of the story of Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, she married when she was 34, and she quite famously said that she'd had a good innings as a single girl, because she travelled extensively in Africa, particularly in Kenya. And so it was decided that to help her recover and to recuperate after her miscarriage, that she would go to Kenya. But they were asked by government sources to call in on the Windsors on their return home. And Alice writes about this in her memoir. And she writes about she still had the red dust of Kenya in her hair, and that they arrived and were quickly taken out to dinner with the Windsors. They were taken somewhere very smart. And I don't think it was the kind of place that either Alice nor Henry really felt comfortable in, because they were neither of them particularly interest in society and socializing. They were both quite shy, quite private people, but nevertheless, they go away and do this. And you can watch, actually, there's a Pathé newsreel. And if you watch, you can see them, you can see the departure of the Gloucesters. And again, without wanting to read too much into it, because I think you can read too much into body language, neither the Gloucesters nor the Windsors look particularly happy to be there. Neither of them look particularly comfortable in each other's company. They're perfectly cordial with each other. Doesn't look as though they're angry. It doesn't look as though they're having any arguments or anything like that. But it does look slightly lukewarm, and it does look as though the Gloucesters are pleased to be on the plane and going home. But the Gloucesters did receive quite a lot of criticism for associating with them. They were letters in newspapers, and the Gloucesters received letters themselves. I think it's too far to say that it was hate mail, but they were certainly people saying that they disapproved, they didn't think it was right. And so I think that did sort of was used as a litmus test by the government for what popular appetite there was for the Windsors. Of course, we've already heard that the Princess Royal had visited in the previous year, so we know that, and that was reported in newspapers. It wasn't, right. but it was a more private visit. You didn't have the pictures, and you didn't have the newsreel footage of it taking place. So I think that she was able to get away with it, if you excuse the expression, because she'd kept it private, and it was seen as just a private visit to her brother.
You can imagine that people might have felt there's a human aspect to this, and of course you'd still want a relationship with your brother, but there's also a public aspect to this, and you should show a little bit of dignity by not parading it all in public and be seen to bring them in from the cold. I guess people would have thought there was a fine line, but they maybe thought that Princess Mary kept to the right side of it, and that the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester didn't, which was a bit unfair if the Gloucesters, who don't even really like the Windsors, were told to do it anyway.
Well, yes, it was not their idea. I don't think they were I don't think they wanted to do it, reading from the way in which Alice portrays it, but I don't think that there was ever any suggestion that they would refuse to do it. But it was not their suggestion, it was not their idea. I don't think they were particularly comfortable with the type of Paris nightclub that they were taken. It wasn't their natural environment anyway, and then they received the blame for it. And so I do think that is slightly unfair on the Gloucesters.
Yes,
but
it is, but
we are.
The price of royalty, I suppose.
It is, but I think that it's still interesting because it did help give that judgment. And so there was not another attempt, although it must be said that was 1938. The war did break out the following year, so there was not the opportunity for that to be tested again in peacetime. And then, of course, what do you do with the Windsors during the war? They're in Paris. So during the Phoney War, things carry on more or less as they had been. But at the time of the invasion of Paris, and Paris falls to the Nazis, Edward is a real risk of what would happen to him. Well, firstly, given that there are concerns about him being a Nazi sympathiser, would he be set up as a puppet king in the event of an invasion of Britain? But even if he were not sympathetic towards the Nazi cause, he is still a high-profile target to be captured himself.
Yeah.
So
and of course, potentially giving, as many believe he did, a conversation for another time, giving sensitive information to the other side.
Yes. And it's difficult. Again, we're not really going to go into this here. Hopefully we'll on another occasion. But the sources, I think, are not entirely clear about what his intentions were. And so I think that getting them out of the way was probably the wisest thing to do. I know that he was not particularly happy with what he was offered, but they're sent to the Bahamas to be Governor General. And so
even before then, he'd been very difficult about the move from France to Spain.
Yes.
In terms of this is when war is going on, when young men are losing their lives and mothers are losing their husbands and children are losing their fathers. He's complaining that not enough of his stuff is being bought, that not enough money is being spent on him, that he's not being treated with appropriate style. And for most people that really dislike the Duke of Windsor, and I'm afraid most people that have looked into him do really dislike him, I think this is where the real antipathy starts, is his actions as war breaks out. Way before you get to the potential betrayal of intelligence and his whatever he did or didn't do in the Bahamas.
And you contrast that with George VI and Queen Elizabeth, who are having lines drawn around all of the baths in the royal residences that people are only allowed, was it 3 inches of water, and that they are following rationing. Although, of course, with having their estates, they do have access to a lot of food, game, for example, which is not on the ration.
Mm.
But the king and queen and the other members of the royal family during the war are seen to be sharing in the privations of the majority of their subjects. And yet you
Yes.
contrast that with him, and he's more standing on ceremony. And of course, after the war, there is one of the biggest, most glittering events post-war is, of course, Princess Elizabeth's wedding. What do you do about the uncle?
The uncle, who I think it's fair to say at this stage is worth just saying, and I know we're going to talk about the war in more detail, hopefully on another occasion, and the fascism in more detail on another occasion. But it's worth saying that at this stage, he's not just an uncle that's got all the social ill graces of being a former king. He is someone that intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic strongly believed was giving sensitive information to the Nazis during World War II. Whether they were right to think so is up for debate, but they seem to think that, and that's a pretty that makes him a pretty contentious figure to have at the wedding of an heir to the heir to the throne.
Of course, and we have to remember that Prince Philip's 4 sisters had married Nazis, and none of them were invited to the wedding either. Although his mother.
Sorry, who's Prince Philip? Is that a friend of yours? I'm not familiar with.
The Duke of Edinburgh, Prince
Thank
Philip
you.
of Greece. Yes. Anyway, his 4 sisters are not invited to the wedding, along with the Windsors are not invited. But there was a note of controversy because we've spoken about Princess Mary and about how close she had remained to her brother. And so she also doesn't attend the wedding. She was invited, chose not to go. And that's widely interpreted as a snub because the Windsors were not invited. And it was talking to Elizabeth Basford that she pointed out that during her research for her biography of Princess Mary, which I would encourage people to read, that came out in 2021, that it was actually revealed that it was because Princess Mary's husband, Lord Harwood, had died earlier that year. And Mary had been, as would be understandable, really rather depressed after the death of her husband and could not face attending a large public event, a royal wedding, in the same venue that she and her husband had been married themselves in 1922. And so she had asked that it be made public that she had a chill. Because, of course, the royal family don't have colds, they have chills.
Yes.
On either the 18th or the 19th of November, with the wedding taking place on the 20th, people see through this and say that it's not that she doesn't really have a chill, it's because she doesn't want to be there, but then assume that rather than it being because she couldn't face the wedding, it's because she is wanting to stay away because her brother's not invited. But actually, the 2 siblings are together when they learn of their mother's final illness, because Queen Mary's health was declining after the death of George VI in 1952. Edward was in New York. Mary had been on tour in the Caribbean, and so she went to New York, and the siblings sailed together on the Queen Elizabeth as they came home to be with their mother at the time of her death. So they did spend that time together, and there had been a falling out between the new regime and Edward at the time of George VI's death around what possible annuities he might receive under the new reign. And I think that their mother's death was an opportunity for him and Mary to reconnect, because although she had not, as we were saying earlier, around the visiting him after the abdication, she does not give up her brotherly relationship, but she firmly toes the line with first her brother and then her niece. She was, from what we understand about Mary, was quite a shy individual, and so she would never have stood up to her brother or her niece in favour of Edward had she felt that way. But there's no real evidence that she didn't. She was I think she was one of those people. My reading of her is that she was somebody who was able to compartmentalize. She loved her brother, but she was also very dutiful towards the crown, and so she didn't see that the two were necessarily something that you couldn't achieve. She could still be Edward's brother. Edward could still be her brother, but yet she could still be a dutiful servant of the crown.
Yes,
and it was. I think it was Edward who found that more difficult to separate than she did.
Yes, I can, and you can understand that from both their perspectives, can't you? So in the case of the Princess Royal, you completely understand why she wants a relationship in a familiar way, but recognizes that can't be, that there has to be limits on that because of the public perceptions. But from his point of view, rejection is just rejection, and I understand that. I think it's human. And while there does seem to be this consistent theme with Windsor in the decades that follow the abdication, that he never seems to quite get the significance of what he's done, or why it might create quite a problem for other people, and he has to live with the consequences of that. I also get it, because he's a human being, and as human beings, when something like that happens, we either collapse and think we've done something terrible and live a life of paralysis, or we double down, we focus only on sides of it which are true but not necessarily the full truth, and make that reality a sort of objective reality. It's human.
It is. Now, we talked a lot in this series about Edward and about his character. What's your reading of him post abdication?
I think first of all, I think we should do a proper reflection episode, one on Edward and one on Wallace, and we can do that as bonus episodes, because I think there's so much to talk about. There's everything from his rumoured sexual deviance to his Nazi sympathies to conditions around him being, having the mind of a child. There is so much, and it owes far more to thought than to real source material. In terms of what I think of his behaviour post abdication, I think what we are seeing is a man without purpose who occasionally makes an attempt to find a purpose, and those attempts are all entirely disastrous. I think we saw previously with Edward, when he was king, that he did want to be king, but only on exactly his own terms. And if he couldn't have everything his way, he wasn't interested. I think we see him, after he leaves the throne, as a man who wants to have a role, but will only have a role exactly on his terms. So there's no, well, I can't do this, but maybe I could throw myself into this cause, work hard, makes a difference. I won't necessarily get everything I want out of it, but I can make a difference. So I just think we see him as lost, and it's a sad existence in so many ways. What do you think?
I think that's true. I think that he comes across, rightly or wrongly, as rather childlike and rather self-centered. And certainly I think that comes across in his treatment of Wallace, because although she has faced a lot of the vitriol for being the one, she's the one that's pinched our king and all of that, essentially what she then have to do, she has to spend the rest of her life trying to make him happy. And if that's somebody who is not able to find happiness in himself, then I think that's probably difficult. I think that he probably led her a bit of a merry dance, to be honest. But that doesn't mean to say I don't think she had any affection for him, but I think that, it was quite a suffocating life. If you look at Diana Mosley's biography of Wallace, and the reason I quote this is because she knew them fairly well after the abdication and spent time with them. She would say that if ever he was there and she'd been delayed when she was out shopping, or it'd be constant, where's the Duchess? Why isn't the Duchess back? Where? And so you can imagine that it was quite a stifling existence, albeit a gilded one, and one which had opened doors to them. But to also be fair, I think that when you look at footage of the two of them together post abdication, they do look relaxed and happy in each other's company most of the time.
It's interesting that I mean, yes, it's tricky. I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because these things are so subjective. I think when you watch the interviews of them from the late 60s, I think he looks hopelessly devoted and obsessed with her, and I think she looks completely bored, like she doesn't want to be there, and that she's missed her chance of anything good in life. I mean, but that's such a personal perspective, and no doubt I am putting a perspective on it that I've come through from other things. I think that what Wallace gets is she does get the financial security that she's looking for, because we know from her early life she was a poor relation of a rich family, meaning she was never without, in the sense that she was never going to starve because she had an uncle and other figures who wouldn't let that happen. But her and her mother had no agency, no ability to decide anything for themselves, because they were dependent, as a widow and an orphaned daughter, they were dependent on the grace and favour of others. So I think she does get that. Edward is a rich man, whether he accepts that or not. What I think is interesting is something Adrian Phillips said to me when I spoke to him some weeks ago now, in the early parts of this series, that there's a sense with Edward that he's still always trying to impress Wallace, and that he's trying to show her that he he's still important, because Wallace had originally fallen for him really because he was the Prince of Wales and that was impressive and all the rest of it, not because of anything about his character really. And I think you could even read, and I'm not saying this is the best read, but you could even read Edward's potential dalliances with Nazis and giving information to the other side and being a significant figure going to visit Hitler, as if just trying to prove to Wallace that he was still a person of relevance. And that's tragic in every possible sense of the word tragic.
I think there's probably some truth in that, but I think it's rather charitable of him to suggest that he did those things only to impress her. I think that's probably part of it, but I think it's partly through his restless spirit wanting to prove himself to
I,
himself on the world stage as well.
yeah, and I think even in the way he's doing it for Wallace, it's still selfish in the sense that he's doing it to look good in front of Wallace. And I mean, if you look at the way that young men try and look good in front of women and impress them, and the younger they, I think men do that throughout their whole lives, but when they're younger, they do it in a more obvious way because they've not yet learned the kind of subtler ways that you could do that. And if you watch teenage boys around girls, it's sweet, it's scary, it's funny, it's all those things. And Edward, with this sense that he's somewhat childlike as a character, perhaps never quite masters how to do it subtly, and like he'll literally go and meet with dictators and facilitate the invasion of France to show his girlfriend that he's cool. I mean, it's comic and awful and brilliant all at once.
But to bring their story to a close,
Which we're not very good at doing, are we?
no, but to look at what happened after then, we see that the relationship with the royal family never quite thaws. We see that Edward does attend the funerals of both George VI and of Queen Mary in 1952 and 1953 alone, without Wallace. And we also see that when he has an eye operation in 1965, he has that in London, and Queen Elizabeth II does visit him there. Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother, doesn't. Also, his sister Mary, Princess Royal, does visit him, but she dies very soon afterwards. So that glue, which was keeping him towards the centre of the family, has now gone. Interestingly, we see, although the Duke of Kent had died in 1942 and Princess Marina visited Paris several times post-war, we don't see any real evidence of a particular closeness between Marina and the Windsors. Although in 1967, when both Wallace and Edward are invited to the unveiling of a plaque to Queen Mary at Marlborough House, and that's the only time that they are both ever invited to an occasion. Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother, was said that she wasn't going to attend if Wallace was there. In the end, she does. They do
Mm.
exchange words. Wallace doesn't curtsy to her, but she does curtsy to the Queen, and
Wow.
you can see the footage of that, and it
Mm.
is,
Mm.
it looks really rather uncomfortable. Princess Marina is used here to give them lunch afterwards, so that
Right.
the rest of the royal party have a luncheon and go to the Epsom Derby, which is being held the same day, whereas Princess Marina is asked to host them for
Mm.
a lunch at Kensington Palace. Although sadly Marina dies the following year, so Marina is not ever going to act as a bridge between the Windsors either. And then, of course, in 1972, this is when we see Edward die himself.
Mm.
But the real irony is that at the time that he's terminally ill, the Queen and Prince Philip are paying a state visit to France and are going to be in Paris. And so there had been discussions about what would happen if he died during the visit. Say he could die before, he could die afterwards, but if he were to die
Yeah.
during that visit, it would be extremely uncomfortable for the Queen. In the event he doesn't die during the visit, he does die shortly afterwards. The Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the Prince of Wales do visit,
Mm.
and Edward is too ill to come outside for photographs. They are photographed with Wallace. The Queen is taken up to visit him, and he makes a supreme effort to stand up to greet her. Almost loses a drip
Mm.
that has
Mm.
been attached to him. Wallace is heard to remark later that the Queen didn't appreciate the supreme effort that he was making. Whether that's true or whether that was her natural reserve, I couldn't
Mm.
say.
Mm.
But certainly Wallace is very upset by this, and she is invited to stay at Buckingham Palace ahead of the funeral, which takes place at Windsor. Trooping the Colour takes place that Saturday, and it's not cancelled even though
Mm.
Edward had been former king. The Queen and the Royal Dukes do wear black armbands
Okay.
on, and there is a Piper's Lament made, and there is a rather haunting photograph of Wallace looking out of the window at Buckingham Palace. She doesn't formally attend the
Mm.
ceremony, doesn't appear on the balcony with the members of the royal family, but there is a picture of her looking
Mm.
through a
Mm.
window at Buckingham Palace, looking very lost and very forlorn.
Mm.
And it's again said that the royal family were rather respectful but cold towards her. So the
Mm.
Queen, instead of inviting her up to her private apartments for lunch, the Queen goes to her to have lunch with her
Mm.
because it said that the Queen felt more comfortable in that setting rather than inviting Wallace into her
Right.
more intimate quarters. After then, of course, Wallace, her health declines after the death of Edward. She suffers from dementia and she suffers from paralysis, and she
Mm.
is well. There are a lot of rumours about abuse of her and about her money being whittled away. Again, it's difficult to judge how that is, but when she does die in 1986, she is given a royal funeral at St George's Chapel, Windsor.
Mm.
Her body is met by the current Duke of Gloucester, Richard, which I thought was rather interesting, actually, given that there'd never been a much of a
Mm. Mm.
relationship between his father and the Windsors,
Mm.
rather than, say, by the Duke of Kent, who was very active
Yes.
on the
Yeah.
royal stage at that stage. He could have been the member of the royal family deputed to meet it, but no, it
Mm.
is Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And other members of the royal family do it. All members of the royal family do attend
Okay.
the funeral, including Queen Mother, Queen,
Mm.
Duke of Edinburgh, and more interestingly as well, we talked about him not going to about Edward not being invited to Princess Elizabeth's wedding. He didn't go to Princess Margaret's wedding, nor Princess Alexandra's, and yet both Margaret and
Right.
Alexandra are present at both his funeral and at
Mm.
Wallace's
Mm.
funeral in 1986. And that brings their story to a close.
And probably not the happiest ending in the world, but then that's true for so many of us. It's a story full of poignance, almost from beginning to end. It's a story that has controversy at almost every moment of it. But is it fair to say that at the end, there's at least some calm?
I think that it's fair to say that even if there was never any warmth between Edward, Wallace, and the royal family, that they did with both of their deaths and in their final years, at least make an attempt to be kind and to be respectful.
Mm.
Wallace may have interpreted that as coldness, and I'm not saying there may not have been a degree of coolness in their approach, but I think that there was this recognition that they were both rather elderly and therefore that they were deserving of some respect due to their age, if not their positions within the family. And so I think that you would be hard pressed to come up with an argument that they were deliberately hurt during those times.
And there's just so much humanity on all sides, aren't there? So you can understand if the royal family were perhaps slightly frosty, polite but frosty, you can understand the humanity behind that.
Well, I think you can understand that it was an embarrassing position for all of them. For Edward, Wallace, for the Queen, all members of the royal family, it would be a difficult position for any of them to be in.
And the Queen spent her teenage years hearing stories about how Wallace had ruined their lives. Probably, I mean, that's whether that's fair doesn't really matter. It's what you've heard, and from people you respect, your parents. And similarly with Wallace and David, you can understand how if they did feel snubbed or frozen out, that is human too. I mean, there's this is a political story, the abdication crisis, but it is full of human moments, and I think at its very end, it's got a very human moment.
I know, and that's it. Although it's not quite it for this series, because we are going to be back next week, as we said earlier, answering your questions. So please get your questions in before the evening of the 6th of February. And I'm really looking forward to having these questions and to have the opportunity to try and answer them.
Me too.
I'm sure you are too.
I certainly am.
Well, until then, we'll leave you for now. And as I say, please get those questions in. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
Royal Revolutions is a Royal History Geeks podcast. For more information about our other podcasts, head to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. The Royal History Geeks community is active across Facebook, X, YouTube, Instagram, and Discord. Just search for Royal History Geeks on your social platform of choice, and you should find us there. The first episode of Royal Revolutions dropped in December 2024. The entire first season will focus on the abdication crisis. Toward the end of season 1, we will devote an entire episode to questions, so please get in touch with us via our socials or at royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com to send any questions about the abdication crisis our way.